I don't think anyone goes into a marriage thinking it could eventually end. However, life happens. Sometimes things don't work out as we hope or plan they will, and we have to course correct. As someone who's newly engaged, I want to make sure I think about all aspects of life and finances once our marriage begins. I've also worked with plenty of clients who have been divorced or have gone through a divorce during our time together. It's hard. That's why I'm so excited to chat with attorney Ashley Nicole Green on this week's episode of the City Girl Savings Podcast. Ashley and I are going to discuss how women can navigate life and finances before marriage, after a divorce, and everything in between. So, Ashley is an attorney specializing in family law, divorce, adoptions, child custody, and child support cases. Ashley is based out of Houston, Texas, and serves clients around the Houston and Galveston areas. Ashley has been practicing family law since 2015 and is the host of the Legal Mumbo Jumbo podcast. Ashley enjoys spending time with her husband and sons, traveling, and participating in community events to help those in need. Welcome to the show, Ashley. I am so excited for this conversation today because, as I was explaining to you, there are so many women in the City Girl Savings community who are engaged like me, who are planning a wedding, navigating a divorce, and rebuilding after divorce. So, this will be such a helpful conversation. But can we start by you sharing just a little bit about yourself and how you ended up becoming a family law attorney?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So a little bit about myself. I'm the oldest of five kids, which I like to start there because that means that I am very type A. I'm very like structured type of person. And I think that that played a lot into why I became an attorney, is that I love to help my siblings growing up, and it kind of fell into my lap of how can I help other people. I was definitely not into like medicine and all that stuff, so I definitely scratched being a doctor off the list pretty early. Um, when I went to law school, I actually had the intent of being a criminal attorney, surprisingly.
Whoa.
Most of us go into law school with this idea of what we'll do, and we get out and we realize, yeah, that's probably not really what we want to do. So, um, I guess the fast version of that is I learned during law school that my interest actually lied with family law cases. And so I clerked for a family law judge here in the Houston area, which I was able to learn and see so many things. And I said, okay, yes, this is definitely what I want to do. Since then, I have obviously became a mom. I'm a wife. I have two amazing boys. One is 5 and one is 1. So I definitely understand those of you who are in those early stages of trying to navigate work and balancing. So that's just a little bit about myself. So yeah.
Wow. Well, we could definitely be friends. I am also the oldest and I am also type A. So we definitely have that in common. But being that I'm newly engaged, and as I mentioned, there are women in my community who are also engaged in planning a wedding, I would love to maybe kick it off with any advice you have for women who are newly engaged and just want to make sure they're financially protected in marriage.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I have a different perspective now that I am an attorney and I kind of see people at their worst. I think sometimes when you think of prenup or you think of financial planning or asking the difficult questions, it can come across as, oh, maybe this person is more interested in the money or they're more interested in something besides the relationship. And I think that that's very unfortunate because it actually shows that that person is concerned about protecting long-term, futures for their spouse, their potential spouse, and also themselves. One of the things that I am definitely not I have never like held back on is that when my husband and I, we were, engaged at some point, we've been married almost 10 years now. We sat down and we had a conversation about what debts we had. We had a conversation about what our finances would look like moving forward. We had a conversation about goals and things of that sort. And we also ran each other's credit report. That was very important to both of us at that time, which probably sounds kind of crazy. We were in our early 20s, but we were very headstrong on, we knew that we wanted to build financial wealth, not just for ourselves, but for our boys, and our, the future that came after us. But that's the first thing, is just being candor upfront with your potential spouse about what your plans are. I learned some things about my husband before we got married that I am glad I did. Like, we're both big savers, but at the same time, my husband's the type of person, if he wants something, he's gonna go buy it. Okay. And I needed to know that, because that's a big integral part of marriage. Like, if you know that your spouse is a spender, right? Set up something so that they have their little account to spend. And so we literally have an account that you can go do whatever you want to do with that money. And it's not going to make me feel any kind of way, because we plan for that each month to put a certain dollar amount in there. I also, my husband knows one thing about me as well. I don't like credit cards. I hate them. I pay them off every month. Like, I have anxiety with it. And so he adjusted to how he paid things and made sure that we did that monthly. So that would be my biggest point, is to have that conversation. The second thing is to think about, I know this sounds kind of bad, but think about your marriage as a business decision. Would you go into a business with this person as your business partner? And that's really how you should think about it. I would definitely go into business with my husband. He's absolutely crazy intelligent, especially when it comes to finances. I trust him. And that was another part of our decision making, on both ends. He had to trust me at some part, because when I first opened my law firm, I had offers on the table for me to go work at some firms, but I took the leap of faith and said, I'm going to open my own firm. And he was not supportive of it initially, because it was scary. We had just purchased the house. We had student loan debts. We were trying to figure out our life, but ultimately, he understood that was important to me. And so we made financial adjustments as need be. And so now he's so glad that I did it, because we're definitely in a good place financially. So those would be my two biggest points, is have that candor conversation and think about, is this someone I would go into business with?
I think that's such a good point. And, just kind of hearing how you would think about finances, although it was a risk for him to take, I think, your personality and the way that you saw finances hopefully gave him a little bit of comfort in knowing that you wouldn't take a crazy risk, that there's a likelihood it wouldn't work out. So I hope that helped play a role in his decision as well.
Yeah, definitely. I hope so. We did definitely sit down, and we did we had a financial advisor later on, but we did do some like risk assessments and things like that. Those are kind of fun, because you learn how much of a risk your other spouse will take, or potential spouse will take. And so that was good. I'm definitely less of a risk taker than he is, though.
Well, you mentioned prenups, and I definitely want to have a conversation about that, because I think there is a stigma around it. But before we do, I just have two kind of general questions for you. So, I'm going to use myself as an example.
Sure.
I have been with my fiance now for 13 years, and we've actually lived together probably for the past 10 years. We have a house together. So my question to you is, what if for whatever reason we don't work out, anything that happened before the marriage, is it still considered 50-50? Is it because we were in a domestic partnership for so long that whatever we accumulated during the time before we were married is kind of up on the table? Like, I would love to hear your thoughts on what that looks like. And I'm in Texas, by the way.
Okay, that was going to be my first question. So thank you for leading with that. So yes, I'm only licensed in the state of Texas. So Texas is a community property state. And so anything acquired during the marriage would be considered community. Anything acquired prior to the marriage is considered separate. So for your specific situation related to the house, each of you own a 50% separate property interest in that home. And so God forbid, if you were to get a divorce in the future, that home would not be treated as community.
Okay.
It would be separate property, and the court doesn't have jurisdiction to divide separate property. The parties could agree to do whatever they want to do. But as far as the court having jurisdiction over that, it would just be on the community. And so I hopefully that answers that part of the question. And the second part, can you remind me what the second part of the question was related to?
Yeah,
And
like any assets that we accumulated during our domestic partnership, so before marriage. It sounds like what's mine is mine, what's his is his. But
yeah,
after we're married, if I purchase my own property, that would still be considered community property. Is that correct?
that is correct. So
Okay.
anything that you had prior to would remain separate, and then, like you mentioned, community thereafter. But I think a big point, and I know we'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second. This is one of the reasons why, especially if you do have some separate property that you acquired prior to marriage, especially if it's joint, like both of you own it, a prenup is a great tool, because once you go through the divorce process, if a party goes through that process, now you're having to trace to show what was separate. It may not, you may not be able to access the bank statements or documents. You may say, well, I put $30,000 down on the house. Well, you may get, may not be able to get statements that go back that far. And so having that prenup to have a clear understanding now, like, this is separate, this is how much is going to be considered for reimbursement and so forth, or no reimbursement, are important factors to consider throughout that. I think the other thing to note is that we have, the law is that it's community, but during your process of considering whether or not you want a prenup, you can actually elect to keep everything separate,
Mm.
even during your even during your marriage, if you go through the divorce process.
Okay. One thing that my partner and I were very good about is 50-50. So, fortunately, if anything were to go wrong, like, that's not going to be an issue, but that's very good to know. And so Texas is a community property state. I know you're only licensed in Texas, but can you give an example of like a non-community property state and what that would look like?
Yeah, so really I've never been licensed in any other state. I went to law school in Kansas. And so I kind of have a little understanding of how it would work. So typically in a state that is not a community property state, they do look at things of basically where the funds came from, how the property or asset was acquired, and then the court will divide it, I guess, in the way that they see most fit. So for an example, let's say that during the marriage, your spouse and you, your future spouse or your fiance and you purchased a home. And if it's not a community property state, the court may not automatically say that that home is part of the community. They may divide it maybe a 60-40 or 30-70. So it's not their presumption that is before the court.
Interesting. Okay. So it is good for a person to know what their state law is. And I guess that's where a prenup can come in. And so let's talk about that, because there is this misconception that if somebody wants a prenup or if someone has to sign a prenup, it's a bad thing. And it's, they're money hungry, or they don't think the marriage is going to last. And I don't think that's true, but can you help shed some light on why prenups are important?
Yeah, so I'll lead with probably the most important thing that I think people should consider is that a divorce attorney is very expensive. We are not cheap. My hourly rate is currently $400 an hour.
Woo.
So anything that I am doing on a case, that is what I'm billing out at. My staff rate is $150 an hour. So if you think about it in that regard, and understand, if you're asking someone to take your whole life and figure out all of the assets that you had over the course of your marriage, and if you have children involved, what happens to your children, that's many, many hours that's going to be required for them to do that. On average, a mildly, I would say, I'm saying mildly, like maybe a few issues are in dispute. A mildly contested case on average is anywhere between 10 to 15,000 in our office.
Wow.
A highly contested case where there are multiple issues that can't be resolved, there's a lot of discovery, there's maybe issues on the financial side as well as the children's side. On average, those can be anywhere from 50 to 80,000. So I tell people that, we do a lot of prenups, and they say, a lot of my clients say, what's the number one reason? It's really the financial aspect. I don't think that people understand how much money could possibly be put down the drain into someone else's pocket, in my case, my pocket, just because you didn't want to plan beforehand. It doesn't mean any of the things that you mentioned earlier, that the marriage won't last or that person's money hungry. It just really shows that you guys are trying to work it out and not leave it in the hands of someone else. That's also a big thing. Having the prenup says, this is how we want this to be divided. This is what we want to occur, so that the court is clear on that. You're not leaving it to a judge that you don't know, or you don't know if they're having a good day or bad day. That's the other thing. You have your trial, and the judge may not be having a good day. They may not listen to anything you're saying up there, right? And so you really, really take a big risk. So I hope that sheds light for people that are maybe on the fence, and even people that maybe are questioning, like, why is my fiance wanting this? Like,
Mm,
I don't understand where this is coming from. It's really protecting overall what you guys have. The last thing I'll lead with is, I gave this example to a client once, because they said, okay, well, let's say we do spend about 80,000 each, right? That's 160,000. Okay, we both spend it. Who cares? I had to break it down and say, okay, listen, $80,000 each, you guys would have had that back in your pocket to divide as part of your property division. So it makes a huge difference. Um, and for them, they didn't even see past that. It was just like, okay, well, it's equal. We're both spending about 80,000. So why does it matter? So I would just say that, if you are on the fence of, why is my spouse asking for this? It could also be to protect you as well, because you would end up getting a little bit more of the community estate if you had that money back in an account.
definitely. And so obviously a prenup is something that you put in place before you're married. What happens if you wanted to change it, or, let's say, 25 years later you get divorced and the prenup, I mean, things have changed so drastically. I mean, what does that look like?
So a lot of times people don't actually do prenups. They will come to us and they'll do what we kind of referred to as a post-marital agreement, a post-nup. It's really more so like a partition suit, or a partition is a technical word, settlement. But what that looks like is the exact same thing that a prenup is. You're letting the court know how you want things divided. You're saying what is separate, what is community. It's really the same process. It's just you're doing it after you've been married. There are clients that we have had that decide to rescind a prenup. Exactly like you mentioned, things have changed and life is different. And so they will agree to revoke it or rescind it. And they may create a post-nuptial agreement thereafter or something else. So that does happen. Um, Life experiences can change things. We had a case where the parties had been married for quite a long time, and the spouse ended up, unfortunately, was going through chemo. They had cancer, but they kind of knew that the relationship wasn't really going to work. But what they had agreed to in the prenup, they understood that wasn't going to work based off of the changes that had happened. So they agreed to rescind that, so that the spouse who was going through, the chemo and things like that, they would get a little bit more than what was contemplated in the prenuptial agreement.
Mm. Okay, so it's good to know that like things can change down the line, but I'm assuming both parties would have to agree to it at that point.
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So what advice would you give to a woman who wants to request a prenup? I mean, and hopefully they've had financial conversations and it's not a huge deal, but what if it is? What advice would you give?
So I think the thing that has really helped a lot of our clients who have came and asked the same question is, I recommend sitting down with a financial advisor or someone that has a background with budgeting and just looking at like big picture, right? Setting up that first meeting in without even bringing up the word prenup, right? Just sitting down and having basically a planning session, planning for retirement, planning for, savings, all those things. And usually it's a lot easier to then come up with a good point to say, okay, listen, we've taken the time to plan this out. This is what our finances will look like. This is what our retirement will look like. How does that make you feel if, God forbid, something were to happen with us and I'm given half of that, or you're given half of mine? And I feel that that usually allows for the conversation to be a little easier, not necessarily completely easier, but a little bit easier, because the framework is, we've already at least laid that foundation. So, my intent is not whatever may be going through your mind whenever I first say it, without having that planning session.
That's great advice. And that's a great way to kind of get both parties in this like financial planning mode. And so if you kind of stick with that mode, that's ultimately the goal of, coming up with prenuptial agreement terms anyways. So, okay, that's super helpful. Very
Yeah.
helpful. So, a handful of my clients receive child support from previous partners, and some child supports are court ordered and others are just agreed upon amounts. Do
Okay.
you recommend people always go through the court system to get child support? And if not, when is it actually a necessity to do so?
So, great question. No, and this is probably a lot of my colleagues or friends or people that are attorneys will be like, oh my goodness, why is she saying that? But I truly don't think every case needs to go to court. Um, I think that if parties are getting along, for the sake of the children and things are working out, you don't need someone to be involved in your day to day, how you raise your child, how much you're paying. A lot of times, court really makes things worse for people. It gives a lot of people anxiety. There's the unknown factor. And sometimes I think it also brings out the worst in each party. And so, if you're at a place where you and the other party have an agreement and it's working, continue to do that is usually going to be my first point. Now, if you are at a place where you have been doing something and all of a sudden the other party says, well, I'm not going to do that anymore, I think that's whenever you need to make the decision to contemplate filing. Um, because it's going to require that person to be financially responsible in a way that keeps them on the hook, and there could be garnishment factors, to make sure that they are paid directly out of their check. But other than that, I think that people should just really try to stay out of court as much as possible. The other thing is that when you go through the court process, um, the court will be over all decision making regarding your child until they're 18.
Mm.
So you have to consider, if I open this case, now I have a set visitation schedule. I have set rights and duties on who can make decisions for education, medical, dental, psychiatrical decisions. There's also the geographical restriction. A lot of courts in Texas are going to put a geographical restriction that requires for you to stay within that area as long as the child's under 18. So you have to, again, going back to what you said, planning. If you know long term you're not going to stay here, then you probably shouldn't open a case here. Because you may be required to stay here, and geographical restrictions are difficult to lift. To your latter question, I think that having an agreed child support amount is perfect. There are parties that agree to an amount that is above guidelines. And what I mean by guidelines is the Texas legislature has placed a percentage of how much a parent would pay for a child. So for one child, it's 20% of their net resources, and it goes up there based off of how many children. But there are times where maybe a 20%, right, amount, let's say it's $400, the parties know, like, yeah, that's not enough, like, and they have an agreement. Maybe the agreement is that they split daycare, and maybe daycare is $600 each, and so that's a total of $200 extra than what that person would be entitled to on the state level. So I would say that if you're in a situation like that where you feel like, well, maybe I shouldn't say anything, maybe I should continue, to have this agreement, that's okay. You can always check with an attorney to see what the child support amount is supposed to be if you feel like that you're getting under that amount.
That's incredibly helpful. I think, you know, I'm not a mom, so my understanding of child support is very minimal, but I just have this preconceived idea that the court says, okay, this is how much, you'll get in child support. I don't even like comprehend the fact that the court can come in and say, well, actually, here's visitation, here's this, here's that, don't leave. Like, there's so much more to it than just getting a financial amount. And I think that's very important for women or people in general to understand.
Yeah, Texas is one of the states that unfortunately incorporates child support, conservatorship, which a lot of people use the word custody, but it's conservatorship, and then possession and access, which is usually referred to as visitation, all into one order. There are some states that do not do that. They have a
Okay.
separate order just for child support, and they have a separate order for visitation and or custody. And so you have to know what state you're in. You have to know if that court is going to require those things that you just mentioned.
Definitely. Okay. Good things to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Now, kind of pulling the thread through on that a little bit. Let's say that someone does go through the system and child support is ordered. What if the child support is not being paid? Or what if the party who is ordered to pay child support stops working? Like, is it just they're out of luck, the person who should be receiving the support?
So in Texas, you can go through the process of filing an enforcement. And so that's a separate lawsuit where the intent is to let the court know, one, that the person is behind on their child support obligation. It will allow for the court to hold them in contempt of court, which could include a variety of things. It can include them being sentenced to jail, which I'm usually, if I'm filing an enforcement and if it's like the first time that the person has got behind, I usually encourage my clients, like, putting them in jail is not going to help. Like, we need them out trying to find a job. But you can technically ask for the court to sentence them to jail time. But most of the time, you're probably going to be wanting to request them to be on community supervision and enroll into a program to allow for them to have assistance in getting a job. That is a provision that was recently updated by the legislator that the court now has the authority to do that. And so it will allow for them to have accountability because they have to check in with someone to say, okay, what is the status on this, interview or your job? And it'll also ensure that during that community service provision or that they don't get behind and you have to refile, because the case will
Mm,
remain open. You'll have what's called compliance hearings. And during those compliance hearings, the court will hear evidence as to whether or not they are in compliance with the new terms. If they're not, then of course you can ask to revoke the suspension of them being in jail, and you can ask for the court to order them to jail. So it definitely has some teeth, and it's something to definitely think about, especially if you're on the side where you're behind on child support. There are things that could also limit you being able to work. Like, sometimes they'll suspend your driver's license, they'll put a hold on your passport, they'll put a hold on you being able to register your vehicle. So there's a lot of things that can play into that. And so you definitely want to take the obligation serious and make sure that if you are in a place where you do lose your job, like you asked, that you go and ask the court to reduce your child support to the minimum wage, even if it's for a temporary basis, and
mhm.
so that you can at least make something. Now, a lot of times people think, well, if I'm not working, then I shouldn't pay anything. It doesn't work like that.
Okay.
At least not here in Texas. Even if your child support previously was ordered at $1,000 a month and you lose your job, your child support doesn't go to zero. It would
Okay.
go to the minimum wage amount at that time, which is currently about like 220 something for one child. And so again, just making sure that you're taking the time to do that, because otherwise that $1,000 per month will continue to incur, and you can be responsible for that and
Oh,
will
wow.
most of the time. Yeah.
So at what point are wages garnished, like to pay back ordered child support?
So typically in any child support order, the court is going to issue a wage withholding order, which automatically garnishes. Now, if you do have, let's say you file an enforcement and the person is behind, I don't know, let's say $5,000. You may have, as part of the stipulations of the agreement, that they pay an additional $100 per month until they satisfy that $5,000. And so in the wage withholding order, it would be updated to garnish their wages now at that additional amount each month as well. So usually in all cases, the court's going to order garnishment. It is sometimes you can put a request to suspend the garnishment, as long as that person is not behind more than 30 days on their child support.
Got it. Okay. And then let's say a woman has a child with the child's father. They were never married. It's just a co-parenting relationship. And let's say the woman has the child 75% of the time and is not getting any support, is requesting support and not getting it. So she files to have child support set up, I guess. Um, would the courts look at it as she has majority custody and therefore she'll automatically get support? Or is that, again, some naive thinking?
Yeah, it's definitely some a little bit of naive thinking. Usually the court is going to maintain the status quo. So if the status quo has been that that parent has had the child 75% of the time, more than likely 99% of the time, the court's going to continue with that. But there are factors that the court also has to consider, which is best interest of the child. I can't tell you how many times I've had cases where a mother has thought that way or a father has thought that way, right? It happens on both ends.
Mhm.
Well, I've had the child, I'm going to keep the child and so forth. And you get to court, and when the court is looking at the Holly factors, which is what we look at, right, for best interest, that parent may not meet all of those requirements. And the other parent may be the parent who the court feels the child would flourish more with in that home. And so, 99% of the time, yes, but you definitely don't want to just automatically assume that.
Okay. So talking with someone is really going to be your best bet to get a good understanding for your situation.
Yeah. And I'll tell you and give you an example of how this happened in real time. So there was a case where we were hired probably about 3 years ago. A mom had the child the majority of the time. But our argument at the temporary orders hearing was, Your Honor, yes, she's had the child the majority of the time because she has secreted the child from my client. So therefore, we should not reward her for keeping the child away from my client for 105 days. Like, I'll never forget it because that was like my closing. It's been 105 days. He hasn't seen his kid. And at the end of that case, that temporary orders hearing, the court gave my client the dad primary. But
Wow.
again, to your point, she had had the child for 105 days all the time. So
Right.
that's what I was saying. Don't automatically assume that, because you definitely have those factors that the court has to consider as well.
Oh, yeah, that's crazy. I'm sure you've seen some stuff.
Yes.
So I know, you don't just specialize in divorce and child support, but family law as a whole. I would love to hear your thoughts on some ways parents can set their children up for financial success. So whether that's, a trust or child specific bank accounts, like any initial thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, so this is really me kind of grabbing into my personal bag at this point. Um, just in terms of what I have done for our boys, and what I have seen clients who have done it well, how that has panned out for them, and clients who haven't, how it has gravely impacted them, especially if they are going through a custody or a divorce case. So with both of my boys, we opened a 529 the month they were born, and we put an amount into that account each month. I do have clients that say, the 529 doesn't yield as much of a return, so they want to do a traditional IRA. I'm going to give a little bit of some input into that. So if you do a traditional IRA or something of that sort, you have to consider that even if the intent is that the account is for the children's college savings, let's say, the money is owned by the community at that point.
Mm,
And so if you go through a divorce, that account will be split. And I'm not going to say the court's not going to care, right? That it was the intent was that. It's just as far as the account and what the court has to divide, it's part of the community estate. Now, that does not automatically mean that the 529 account, the court cannot, do something with that. But the difference is that typically on the 529, there's a custodial of the account, one parent, but it's for the benefit of a child. Usually. Now, sometimes people do set up 529s and they're a family 529. And a family 529 is obviously different because the money can be used by anyone in the family for college, right?
Mm.
Or educational expenses. And so to truly protect that from happening, I always recommend a child specific 529 versus a family. Um, the other thing that I think is really good is that estate planning. You definitely want to make sure that you're preparing for your children. If God forbid something were to happen, you know, my husband and I, my youngest, when we had him, obviously he wasn't in our will. And so we were going to Dominican Republic, and I was having anxiety because I was like, oh my God, he's not in our will. What if something happens and we're not, you know,
Oh,
with him? So I literally like we set up an appointment to like update our will because I was having like anxiety that he wasn't in there. Because I didn't want a situation where God forbid something happened to us and then he wasn't, you know, entitled to something. Although I think my family would have figured it out, but still.
yeah.
Um, and then in speaking of that, we do have a contingent trust. Some of my clients do like to have a trust and they fund the trust in the present. But you have to think about the tax implications of that. You have to think about all of those things. And I'm no financial advisor. I'm nothing into financing. I stay in my lane, but I know that much about it, right? And so I usually tell people really sit down with someone who does, you know about these things and figure out, okay, do I want to fund this trust? Which means that I have to rename everything in the name of the trust, my house, my car, my bank accounts, my beneficiaries, my pay on death beneficiaries, all those things. And do I really want to do that? Or do I want something to be put in place in the event that my children are underneath a certain age? So those are things to start having conversations about. We have a contingent trust. If our boys are under 23, they will not be getting that money if we're gone. There will be a trust set up, but we feel like if they're over 23, we pray to God that they will, you know, do right with the money.
Definitely. Definitely. So there are a lot of options for people, and I think it goes back to just being knowledgeable and knowing what your options are and what's best for your situation and then getting those things set up.
Yeah, definitely.
So I want to make sure we talk about divorce because, as I mentioned, there are a lot of people in the community that have gone through a divorce or are currently going through one. So, what advice do you have for women who think they may need a divorce and they don't have a prenup, um, or they're actually going through a divorce and maybe they're being bullied and intimidated? Any just overall advice for those situations?
Yeah, so I'll start with the latter. If you're in a situation where you feel like you're going through a divorce and you're getting railroaded, my first question to you would be, do you have an attorney that is truly a good fit? I have always stood by the fact that I am not the right attorney for everyone. And I take that very serious because going through a divorce is a very emotionally draining process. And there's nothing worse than having an attorney that you just don't get along with. Um, and so that would be my first question. The reason why I would ask that question is because if you are feeling that way, if you're experiencing that, if you're feeling bullied or you're experiencing anything related to that, it's probably because you're feeling like you're not being heard or your positions aren't being advocated. So that means that there's a breakdown in communication with you and your attorney. And that breakdown in communication can just be that, people communicate differently. There are some people that communicate very well in writing, and some people are the type like, I have to have a face to face with you. I have to come in and talk to you. And, so know if your attorney can accommodate your specific requests. The other thing I would ask that you probably consider is, have you differentiated between your attorney being your legal advocate and your attorney being your counselor? Those are big differences. I tell my clients all the time, I am not a therapist. I do not have a
Mhm.
license to be a therapist. I will hear you, but I'm only going to hear you for so long because you're paying me $400 an hour to hear you, and I can't give you any solutions because I'm not a therapist.
Right.
I can give you legal advice, I can give you legal solutions, but if it's, listen, I'm feeling bad, I'm having a bad day, he's, the worst person in the world, she's the worst person in the world, that's a therapy conversation. So that would be my second question, is that are you feeling this way maybe because you're relying on your attorney to fill a void that they're really not licensed to do? The other question is in relation to if you don't have a prenup. If you don't have a prenup, it's okay. I would say 90% of people, if not more, don't have a prenup. Most people come to us, they do not have any type of planning about what was going to happen. So you are not alone. But you do have a little bit of a heavier load. You need to start gathering legal documents. So retirement accounts, bank accounts, any and everything that is an asset, you need to gather those and try to go back as close as possible to the date of marriage. Depending on how long you've been married, that may be difficult because records may not be available. But during your discovery process, those documents are going to be requested by the other side, and the court's going to require that you produce those. So get a head start and start gathering those. Also, I would say a lot of times people think that divorces have to be nasty and drawn out, but they don't. A lot of people do come to us and they have what's called uncontested divorces, where they have sat down and they have, for the most part, reached an agreement on all issues, and they may need a little bit of guidance to make sure that that agreement is going to be accepted by the court. And so try to have those conversations, again, going back to that openness. And then lastly, I would say, if you're going through the process and you don't really have a good grip on like, what does my finances look like? What's going to happen with the children? You don't want this drawn out process. You don't want to be in court litigating. Consider a collaborative divorce process. That's where you'll have a financial advisor, a therapist, and an attorney, and you work as a team on both sides to make sure that you're able to achieve all of those things without the nastiness sometimes that divorce brings. And so, yeah, that's what I would tell somebody.
So let's say a man and a wife are, it's not working out and the wife wants to initiate a divorce, but maybe she's a stay-at-home mom and, doesn't make money, but watches the kids. Should she be worried, assuming that there is no prenup and maybe that her partner doesn't want a divorce or knows her situation and can afford to draw it out? Like at what point would she be okay moving forward?
Yeah, good question. That happens a lot as well. And actually here lately, it's been happening on the other end. A lot of dads are stay-at-home dads, which I love. I think that's great. Like, it doesn't
Yes.
matter, right? Like we can both do those things. I think if you're in that situation, you have to be realistic with yourself. A lot of my clients that come in that are stay-at-home moms or stay-at-home dads, the first question they ask is, am I going to get alimony or spousal support? Texas is a state that does not look favorable on that. We're definitely a state that you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The burden to get when we call it actually post support maintenance, is a high burden. Because you have to show the court that your basic minimum needs cannot be met. So not you can't maintain your lifestyle that you're accustomed to, your basic needs. So food, shelter, clothing. So if you have an education, if you have any type of work experience, those are things the court's going to look at and say, okay, you need to go get a job, right?
Mhm.
I have had many cases where people come in and they say, I've been married to this person for 25 years and, I'm entitled to this. Well, the thing is that the court's going to likely give you what you're entitled to through the division of the community estate. But that doesn't mean in the meantime, in addition to that, your spouse is responsible for providing care for you automatically.
Mm.
If there's enough in the community estate to sustain you, whether that's through the sale proceeds from a house, a 401k cash out, an IRA transfer, the court is not as probably likely to give you monthly spousal maintenance.
Okay. And, you have actually brought up 401k retirement plans a couple times. So if somebody is married, doesn't have a prenuptial agreement, and is basically growing their retirement account, is that considered community property, at least in Texas?
Yes, it is.
Mm.
So if you don't have that pre-dumped or a
Mhm.
post-nuptial agreement or something that segregates it, yes, it's going to be community. Now, if you had money in there prior to marriage, let's say you had $50,000 in there, you could ask for the court, as long as you can trace it and show it clearly, for the court to confirm that 50,000 as your separate. That gets into another question of like tracing and all that, because there's the, do we say it's 50 or do we say it's 50 plus the gains and losses on the 50? So which again is outside of my area. We refer that out to an expert, a financial forensic accountant to do that. But that's why I was saying earlier, like this process can become very expensive.
Definitely. Definitely. So I can only imagine that, money can make a divorce difficult, but so can children,
Yeah.
can make the process much harder. What should people know when it comes to divorce, especially if incomes are unequal and children are involved?
Um, the thing I would say is to really focus on the best interest of your children. Not how much you're going to pay in child support or how much you're going to lose if you have to pay child support. Um, Not to be vindictive so the other party can't see the child and use the children as a weapon against the other party because they wanted a divorce or they cheated or they did whatever. Um, in our firm, the motto, our mission is children at the center of every decision. And that's something that I really, really drive home to my clients. If a client typically starts losing sight on that, we're probably at the end of our attorney-client relationship, which usually doesn't happen. Most people are like, okay, yeah, you're right, Ashley. I'm over here in the weeds. I need to come back. Um, but if you keep your focus on that, you will realize that in the end, what matters most is that your children are happy. And sometimes that's a hard decision, right? So if you are a client, like I have clients that travel a lot, right? They're always on the plane. I have clients who work shift work at the plant. You probably can't likely do a 50-50. Like, let's be realistic, right? Or you probably can't be the primary parent because you just don't have the time. It doesn't mean that you're not a good person, doesn't mean that you weren't an involved parent. It just means that time-wise, that's probably not a factor. But let's talk about other ways you can be involved within children. Maybe you get extra time in the summer. So just being creative and being flexible to know that at the end of the day, it's about the kids.
Definitely. Now, we've talked a lot about community estate and community property in terms of assets, but what about debts?
So in Texas, we don't have a thing called community debt. And sometimes you'll hear people say that, like attorneys even say, we're like, this is community debt. Um, but anything that was purchased during the marriage is going to be included into the property division. So the best way I explain it to clients is all of your assets are put on a spreadsheet and there's a column for all of them. And then all of your debts are typically put on there as well. The court is going to factor in the debts whenever dividing the assets into the into the between the parties for the community property. But there are certain debts the court may say, yeah, we're not going to include that. And so an example of that would be, let's say that someone has an affair and they go and they spend thousands and thousands on this person that they're having an affair with. Well, there may be a waste claim, right? Argument that this person has wasted community funds to foster a relationship that did not benefit the community. Well, that debt is not likely going to be included if the
Good.
court feels that way into that. Another example is, let's say you're going through the divorce process and somebody goes and spends $15,000 for a shopping spree. Yeah, probably not going to be a reasonable, necessary, expense. And so we can argue that that be not included as well.
What about, and I've had this happen to a couple of clients where they open cards or take on loans in their name, but it's really for their partner. And then, things don't work out and the partner doesn't pay the debt.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
I can imagine.
um, and it's an unfortunate situation because this is what I tell clients. The court cannot force the creditor to refinance or force the creditor to take it out of your name. And the other thing that is really sucky, is that even if you were to go and enforce that, let's say exactly what you said, they were ordered to pay $400 a month towards the debt and they just stopped paying it. You can go and file an enforcement, but it's a different chapter of an enforcement, and so it doesn't have the same teeth, so to speak, as a traditional enforcement, and so they can't be likely put in jail or anything like that. And so, as best as I could say, if you're in a situation like that, see if there's a way where you can tilt the scale so that maybe you get more money and you just pay that off so it's out of your name versus relying on them to pay it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Sometimes they won't.
Yeah.
So, or just don't take a loan out for somebody else.
Yeah.
Easier said than done, though. Very, very informative. I have a final question for you. Based on your work and your experience, what should people keep in mind? Maybe the top thing to keep in mind before, during, and after divorce, especially if no kids are involved. If kids are involved,
Yeah.
keep the kids in mind. But outside of
Yeah.
that, what advice would you give?
I would say to keep your emotions out of it as you're making decisions. Emotions are going to automatically be part of the divorce process during, after. But when you're in decision mode, put your feelings aside and truly have someone that is part of your support system that's going to hold you accountable to make sure that you're not making a decision based off of how you feel, and instead it's, a logical, rational decision. In saying that, I can't stress enough, support family, friends, um, you know, community of individuals who are going through what you're going through is so important throughout this process. It is financially draining, but it is just as much as emotionally draining. And so having someone where you can debrief with and just say, oh, today was just a hard day, right? And they're going to hear you out. They're not going to bill you $400 an hour to hear you out, is important, because this process can sometimes make you feel alone. It can make you feel, after you've gone through it, you start questioning, man, did I do the right thing? Was I not, patient enough? And so taking care of your mental health, I think, all kind of falls into those things.
This conversation has been incredibly insightful for myself, and I'm sure for listeners. So thank you so much, Ashley. Before we wrap, where can listeners connect with you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So definitely you can find me on Instagram, Law Office of A. Green. I have a Facebook as well. I just got into the TikTok world, so I'm on TikTok. I'm like, there's so many platforms nowadays. I'm also on LinkedIn, Ashley Nicole Green. And then of course you can visit my website at www.lawofficeofagreen.com. And I'd love to connect with you if you have questions or want to set up a consultation.
Wonderful. And I will make sure to link to all of those links in the show notes so that people can easily get in contact with you. So thank you so much, Ashley, for being here and for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you for having me.